conference this year, a couple of months ago. And for those of you who don't know Mr. Raj Kumar, I'll give a bit of introduction about him, and then I'll have Mr. Raj Kumar is the president and editor-in-chief of Devex. It's a media platform for global development community. He is a social entrepreneur with digital media and a digital media executive. He has been part of 9 presidential campaigns and is a co-founder of the most successful financial information company. He has been profiled in Forbes, the Financial Times, Foreign Policy, the Washington Post, where Devex has been, Devex was called the Bloomberg of foreign aid. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's a great pleasure. And tell us a bit about what Devex is, what's the size, what's its outreach, and how can young professionals use this platform for their career development.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you to all of you. You left out the most important part of my bio, which is president of the Scott Wheel Fan Club. I've been with Scott for many years and have watched him grow Atlas Corps with an incredible team. It is impressive to come back every time and see how much it's grown. The caliber of people that this organization attracts from around the world is really, really amazing. I'm delighted to be invited to speak a little bit here. I'm happy to talk, as you said, about Devex, but you tell me, how do you want me to start?
We can start the discussion with what Devex is, what's its size, what's its outreach, and how can young professionals use this platform for their career development. Young professionals, I mean the employees, and also the business entrepreneurs, young business entrepreneurs. How is this platform useful for them?
Sure, I'm happy to expand on that. So I actually co-founded Devex when I was maybe around the age of some of the people in the room, a little younger, 24 years old. And part of the reason that I helped to start Devex was really not understanding how the global development sector worked. You know, I wanted to work in a mission-driven organization, but it was such a confusing industry. Everyone I would meet would give me kind of a very different perspective about how it works. And I felt like I couldn't just go to one place and read about it. So I would ask people, is there a list online just of the organizations that do development work? I just want to see a list. Or can I see a list of the projects? Or what about jobs? And there must be a place I can go and just see all. And I was surprised there wasn't very basic information. And it turned out when I met people, they would say, go to Washington, D.C. and network. Go to cocktail parties. That's how this industry works. And I was kind of shocked because this is a mission-driven industry, and it's really working through kind of closed club. It's a network of friends, and that's been really part of the problem of the global development sector for many years, and it's one of the reasons we created Devex. So Devex is really, it started as an online community, a way to connect the people doing development work, and it's grown over the years into being a media platform. So in the financial industry, you have Bloomberg. In global development, you have Devex. And the basic idea is we connect the professionals who do this work with the information they need to be more effective in their work. So the news, if you want to know what's happening at the World Bank, what's happening at the Gates Foundation, we're the place you go. If you want to see that list of projects, we now have the world's largest database of projects, of funding opportunities, grants from every agency anywhere in the world. You can look up a sector like clean water in a country like Peru and see who's funding what there, from the Japanese to the Americans to the foundation world, et cetera. We're also the leading place for getting news and information about career opportunities, which is, I think, one of the things we'll focus on a lot today. So we work with a lot of the big UN agencies, the NGOs, foundations. We actually do hands-on recruiting for them. We have a team of recruiters. And then lots of people just come to our site and look at the jobs that get listed there, which are posted by recruiters from hundreds of organizations around the development sector. And they value the Devex community because it's really a specialized community of people who are really in this work as professionals, not just people who want to do good, but who have the skill set to do good. So that's really how we get started, what we're all about. We're 150 staff around the world, headquartered here in Washington with a few offices, reporters working from home in different cities in different parts of the world. Our audience is a little over 1 million development professionals from all over the world as well. And we're growing. We're growing a lot and have a lot of ambition ahead of us to really make the development sector be a more effective and more efficient market.
Okay, that gives us a good picture of what Devex is and I hope its outreach. And moving on to the next question, that is mostly specifically on the skill requirement in this sector, because obviously this platform gives us a good platform which connects employer and employee. So I mean, it gives us a good analysis in terms of the skill requirement that are in this sector internationally, and also in the local context. For instance, there are people from different countries here. They would be very much interested in knowing how has skill requirement changed in these areas, and also if you can give us an advice in terms of like you had a survey next generation professionals. What skills did that survey capture, and how these young professionals can utilize that information?
Right, and you pointed this out at the very beginning of your introductory comments that this is a sector that's going through a transformation.
Yeah.
And I think that's very true, although most people don't focus on that. We tend to think of the newspaper industry, and we know that now more than half of Americans get their news from Facebook, and we think of newspapers going out of business or being really transformed. We know that's an industry in a massive period of revolution and transformation and disruption. Or the automobile industry, we see Tesla and electric cars and how car companies are radically changing their model, and that in maybe a short time we'll all be getting in cars that are autonomously driven, cars that have batteries rather than engines run by gas. And we know that there's a lot of disruption happening in so many industries. But we look at our own industry and we often don't, first of all, think of it as an industry. And we might think it's very slow moving and it's not transforming. And my argument to you is it's actually transforming very quickly. That we are in the same kind of period of disruption that you see in many other industries. And it's going to change the way everyone here works if you pursue a career in global development. So to get more specific about skills, I think one of the most important is around financial engineering and financial innovation. So what was developed, the global development sector, most of the money, the vast majority of the money, if you look at it over the last 70 years since the Marshall Plan, has been US government, British government, French government, big government agencies running big projects through a government contracting model. Either they're granting the money to an NGO or they're signing a contract with a company or an NGO to go execute a project. That flow of money is very specific, and it leads to a very specific structure of the industry. That's shifting quickly. We're moving to an industry where the money is going to come from many other sources, a lot of philanthropy, a lot of private sector, a lot of private investors, and as a result, there's really interesting new models. You've heard, I'm sure, of development impact bonds or blended finance, pay for performance, grand challenges like the X Prize or Grand Challenges Canada. There are so many new models for how you fund development work that if you want to be a professional in the space and you don't know that, and you don't understand how the financial engineering works, it will be hard to execute on a mission. You'll need in the future, much more than in the past, to understand the financial engineering aspect of being a development professional. That's maybe the most important skill set, I think, for the next generation.
Following up on the same note, is there any way, since some of the fellows here are entrepreneurs, is there any way you can change, you can get information about this changing funding sources, changing funding dynamics? How do you kind of like approach these new funders, and who are these new funders? Can you specify, like, you mentioned some of them, but then again, if some of us would be interested in reaching out to them, so if you can discuss a bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So one way you can get that information is from our site, so it's something we're covering a lot, is this transformation and development. We have reporters all over the world writing about how it's affecting development work where they are. So that's one way to get up to speed, like how it works. We have videos that explain things like development impact bonds. How are they structured? They're a little complicated to understand, so we try to make it simple. But once you know that, if you're an entrepreneur and you want to start a development organization today, I think what's different is you need to start to think of what's the right structure, what's the right financial model for my organization. Today, there are not that many funders for these new innovative models. Many of them go back to the Gates Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation. That's very true. But it's shifting pretty quickly. There are more and more billionaire philanthropists in different parts of the world who are following similar models. There are more open platforms. I mentioned Grand Challenges Canada. They have so far, they just started in 2010, and they've so far funded 854 innovative challenges where someone in this room can say, I have an idea for how we can reduce maternal mortality in a particular context. And maybe it's an innovative technology or it's just an innovative practice. You can go to an organization like that and win a grant and take it forward to the next step. At USAID, there's something called Development Innovation Ventures, which was a little questionable what was going to happen to it, and this new administration finally kind of resurrected it. It looked like they were shutting it down for a while. But it's a fantastic, very business-oriented model, which uses tiered funding. The basic idea is very straightforward, although it hasn't existed until recent years. And that is, you come to them with a really good idea, and they give you a small amount of money to try it, to get it to a certain level of proof of concept. If it works, they'll give you more money. If you get to the next stage where you show this can be commercialized, they'll give you even more. And there have been great examples of really successful innovations that have taken off in many parts of the world with that kind of tiered funding model. So to answer your question, there are lots of opportunities, but we're in relatively early stages of it, so you have to be very entrepreneurial. If you're starting an organization now, you really need to meet people, to read, to research. It's not that this is an industry that's so well structured, there's a very clear path. You need to make your own path.
Okay, going back to the skill development question, I want to go back to the next generation professional survey because I think that would be very useful survey report for me and most of us here. What are the skills that you captured in that survey? What are the requirements of the market that you have captured specifically in that survey? I'm asking you this question again because this would you have kind of outlined the future of this sector for the skill requirement. So if you can.
So one of the things that I mentioned already, financial engineering, is very much a key theme that comes out in that survey. But there's another one I didn't mention, and that's around technology. And when I meet people, many people who are at your stage in your career, you might say, well, I'm not a tech expert. Some of you probably are, but some might say, I'm not a tech expert, so what can I do? I don't know how to program. It's not really about being a programmer, although those skills are important. But as you look to the next generation, there's really no development work that will happen that doesn't have a technology component to it. And the biggest shift probably happening in many of the countries that you're from is the rise of connectivity. There's still about half the planet not connected to the internet, but that's changing very quickly. Only about 10 or 15% of the people who are not connected because they simply don't have access. Meaning most of the others, it's an affordability question. And as you get the business models change, you get internet to be cheaper and cheaper. Microsoft has a program in Western Kenya now that's gotten broadband rates down to $3 a month, for example. You start to get some of these prices down, you see connectivity and adoption growing. And that's changing the way people think about doing development work. We tend to think about paper and pen models or SMS models, the lowest tech approaches, because those have been practical. Now, in many contexts, you can actually think about high bandwidth opportunities, at least for maybe for the aid workers or the community health workers, the people that you're directly working with, maybe not the people you're serving quite yet, but we're getting there. Wearable devices are moving quickly, so for the health sector, that's going to be a big shift. And then you've got financial inclusion growing at massive rates. There's still about 1.2 billion people in the world who don't have an ID, they're not registered with the government. That's also changing very quickly. In India, you have the Aadhaar program, which is now registered about 1.2 billion out of 1.3 billion Indians with some kind of biometric rating, either their eye scan or their fingerprint. And those kinds of technologies are being rolled out in refugee camps in many places around the world. So if you are a development professional designing a new institution or designing your career, you need to know, what can I do with these technologies? If you're just thinking about the way programs were developed 10 years ago, you're not going to add the kind of value in a very competitive market that people expect. So you'll need to be able to say, here's how I use financial inclusion, or here's how I use real-time data. Here's how I use artificial intelligence that can be delivered to, say, a community health worker. Here's how I would use these things in designing a program or intervention. And you don't have to be the programmer, but you need to understand what those tools are and how they work. That's really essential to this next phase of being a development professional.
That's very interesting to know. That's more on the technical end of skill development, skill requirement in the market. We often hear the term social emotional learning, and it's very much required in the corporate sector. And we hear about this term, its utility in the corporate sector. Do you think it's equally significant in the development sector, and how do you think it can be utilized, and why should professionals focus on this area?
I think it is, and in fact it came out in that survey as well. We are really, the term that came out in the survey was cross-cultural skills. And I mean, look at this room, which is reflective of lots of development organizations now, and increasingly so, very international. Development used to be quite top-down directed, Americans and Europeans being flown overseas as experts. All of you are emblematic of experts who come from anywhere in the world. They can come here too, right? So that's shifting the dynamic, but in order to work in that kind of context, you need to have cross-cultural skills. You need these soft skills. We call them soft. They're actually not so easy to attain if you don't have them. And that did come out in the survey, and it's quite important when we talk to recruiters. It's one of the things that they're looking for. It's you might have a great resume, you might have gone to all the right universities and have all the right skills, but if you can't operate in an international environment or even across cultures within your country, that's going to be a real impediment to the growth of your career. So I think the survey underlines it. Certainly my experience does as well.
Thank you so much. This covers the most part of the skill demand in the market. Now, if we talk about the skill supply, and most of the young professionals, including myself, have hard time identifying their own skills and aligning them with the market requirement. Are there any tools and approaches out there which can help them, like specifically, for instance, in terms of like some certain management role, or for instance, if you take a position, communication officer, or a leadership position? So are there any tools out there which can help them identify their skills, identify their gaps, and kind of like act on them effectively? Do you think they're...
Our sector is plagued with jargon, and often when I look at resumes in our sector, you see a lot of this jargon. And the problem with it is we can get lost in thinking, I have this skill area, I remember I took a course on this, or I've worked in this area, but not be able to unpack it and explain it in plain terms. But this is what I actually can do. And I think that's the most important thing, is not necessarily talking to people within our industry. Talk to your friends who are not working in global development, and try to explain in very plain terms in ways that they can understand what you do, what your skills are. If they can understand it, then reflect that back to yourself and say, okay, what am I missing? What is there that I can't actually do? Where do I have a gap? Maybe I have a gap around understanding business models. Maybe I understand how to design a project, but making a project sustainable in the long run, thinking through a business model, is something I don't have a skill set in. And when you talk to people who are not in our field, that might come through more clearly than if you were simply saying to someone, well, I have experience in project design and project management and capacity building and training, and you use the kind of jargon that we often use. So the main tool I would suggest is talking to your friends who are not in this sector. Of course, in addition to that, we have lots of tools on our site in the sense of articles and reports and things you can read, but I don't think they replace self-reflection.
That's what I wanted to know. It's particularly, like for instance, it is, you can talk to people, you can get that counseling, but then again, it is also important for people to kind of like have identified on their own in terms of like, this is what I want to, because I think your self-assessment and self-reflection is much more important than in your career than other people will be able to help you and coach you or mentor you better if you know your own skills. So that's what I was referring to when I said if there are any tools that these professionals can utilize to identify their skills. My next question is a question of special interest to me, and I think a lot of young women in the room would be really interested in knowing, because I think there is a lot of gender disparity that exists in this sector. And in labor force in general. So do you think employers are making a conscious effort in terms of including women in different positions, especially the leadership positions? And also in the sectors which are male dominant, like construction, automobile sector, do you think, what's the current trend right now? Has it changed over the years?
I think it's certainly changed, and you do see the development sector more than maybe other industries because it's mission driven, at least saying a lot of the right things. And in fact, if you look at the top positions in many institutions in development, you will see women who are CEOs of NGOs or CEOs of aid agencies. But there still is quite a lot of gender bias if you look across certain subsectors within development. And then if you look more deeply than just the top position. So we've done some survey work on this at Devex, and we found, for example, at board levels, even if the NGO CEOs might be more, there might be more women there than you would see in private sector companies who are CEOs. But if you look at the board level, you still see a lot of imbalance toward men. And these are even in NGOs that are working on kind of soft skills, not in construction, not in automobiles, right? If you look at the multilateral development banks or some of the other finance-related institutions development, you'll see even more male bias. Again, there are examples of women who are doing very well and women who are in leadership roles, and I think there's much improvement, but it's nowhere near where it ought to be. So I think you see that in some of these specific sectors. Then when you look within institutions, oftentimes the cultures are not, even if the policy or the high-level rhetoric, even the intentions might be in a good place, the policies aren't there to support women growing in their careers. And a good example are some of the international institutions that prize travel as a kind of badge of honor. So they, I've talked to women at some of these institutions who are at mid-levels in their career and say it's a real challenge because oftentimes the travel is kind of unnecessary, but the culture is you must travel tomorrow to show that you're committed to the institution. There's a conference, across the world, you have to go there. And maybe you don't really need to go there, maybe in fact it's the kind of thing you can do by video and it's not even that efficient to get on a plane and spend all the money. But that culture is one that is really not prioritizing families. And I think that hurts men and women, but in particular, women find this as a barrier to growing in some of these institutions. So I think there's a lot left to do. My guess is from your question, you're witnessing this yourself, and I think it's a very real issue. So there's a lot left to do. And really, we need your generation of leaders, as you grow up, to be kind of sensitized to this issue, men and women. And as you get into institutions, to try to change that culture, to change certainly policy and leadership, but beyond that, to change the kind of unwritten rules that often lead to discrimination.
Do you think this, if you look at the developing and developed countries, do you see the same trend in both contexts, or there is obviously disparity more? Do you see more disparity in developing countries than in developed countries, or and specific to the sector?
I don't know. Well, first of all, I find that the developed line isn't so real anymore.
I think that it is, yeah.
Right. What is a developing country now? It's hard to say. I think we have to be more nuanced about looking at what counts as a developing or developed country. Maybe really have many more categories of countries. Perhaps it's better to look regionally or look at income levels in the way the World Bank does. So my guess is, even if we did some analysis like that, and we looked developing versus developed within the development sector, it wouldn't tell us much that we can use. Probably it's more useful to look at what's happening in your own context. So the country you're from, or the region you're from, if you think there are specific issues around gender bias in that region, for specific local contextual reasons, then those need to be addressed there in a different way, maybe than in another region in the world. So I can't really answer your question exactly, but I would encourage, if you're going to look at data on this, that we look at it in a more nuanced way.
Okay, yeah, that is really helpful. My last question, and then we can open the forum session to participants. They can ask you questions.
Please.
Get more insight on this area. How do you see the future of Devex? Do you see that in the future Devex will be in a leading position to kind of advise educational institutions, government organizations, and also other social sector organizations in terms of the skill requirement of this area and other requirements on these issues? Do you think that's where you're kind of headed, or that's
it's almost like you've been in some of our internal meetings, because this is definitely the way we think about it. We don't want to just be involved in helping organizations recruit for the needs they see and recruit in the ways they recruited in the past. We want to help drive them to really a different level of excellence. And that means helping them to think through what is their talent strategy. In other industries, especially knowledge industries, there's a focus on talent as opposed to recruitment. What is the distinction? Well, when you think about recruitment, usually your mindset is lots of people are going to apply to jobs here, and we're going to filter out everyone who's not qualified, and we'll find the few we think are qualified. So your job as a recruiter is kind of a filtering process. When you think about talent and talent acquisition, it's the flip, it's the inverse. Your job is, as a recruiter or a talent acquirer, is to go out into the world and find the best talent. And that might be especially the most diverse talent. It might be women for jobs that are typically hired, where you in the past hired men. It might be hire people from countries where you were underrepresented. But thinking about talent in a different way. And I think our industry has been a bit slow to adopt that mindset, in part because of all the government funding that's in our sector and the way we're structured. market is shifting, and we want to be part of that shift. We ourselves at Devex try to think as a knowledge organization in that way, to be proactive in talent acquisition. And we want institutions in our sector to think that way too, and we want to help them do it. So that really is part of the future, especially in our careers and recruitment work. That is part of the future of Devex.
Yeah, I think a lot of institutions can also utilize that information from the field or from your forum and other forums which exist to kind of like adopt that and incorporate that in terms of like, for instance, in terms of like changing their curriculums or changing the job requirements that are out there. Because I think a lot of skill gap exists because the education institutions are not very much aligned with the market that exists out there. So this will be an information channel for them as well to kind of like look upon a lot of areas that need attention.
Yeah.
So that's something which I thought, which it looks like that you're probably moving towards that area.
We are, yeah.
So thank you so much. That was very useful discussion. Now we'll have questions from the participants, and if somebody can, like,
Okay. You call on people and we'll get them on the mic.
okay. Yeah.
Hello? You talk about gender biasness, and my question is ethnic biasness. If we take example of United States, the difference between the wage gap between white and black, Asian, Latinos, there's a lot of difference. So the problem is the wage gap. What are the symptoms that causes wage gap? Why it is so? Is it like their color, or the area from where they belong to, or it's like a skills that they are lacking and they're not coming into the mainstream and getting those jobs that they should have?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, he's asking, I don't know if you all heard the question well, but the question is really about why do we have discrimination in employment, especially in the United States, along ethnic lines, not just along gender lines. And you talked about the various different ethnic groups in the U.S., and you see a difference in the wage gap, which is kind of a symptom of the problem. It is a big question because discrimination along ethnic lines exists in many countries around the world, and for many deep and historical reasons. So I think rather than getting into a long explanation about why we are here, I think the focus should be how do you get out of that, especially if you run an institution in the development sector. Maybe one of your challenges, let's say you're in Washington, you run a development organization, is you need to have diversity within a U.S. context. So diversity along these ethnic lines within the U.S., but also international diversity, as well as gender diversity. And why does that matter? Because if you're serving a population, if you think of yourselves as part of the development sector having customers, and your customers are people in need around the world, if you don't reflect them, it's very hard to actually deliver what they need. So if you're a group of all men, and actually a lot of the challenges are with women, in the world that you're trying to work with and serve, how do you really understand and relate if you haven't changed your own organization? So I think you're pointing out a good point, which is that there's not just one issue of discrimination here that we need to think about across our institutions. We need to think about how do we better reflect the people we're serving across every dimension.
David, who's next?
Is
Okay. Yeah, that's Go ahead.
Well, this is Aman from Pakistan. I have been an active member of Devex, I guess, since 2009 when I started my development career. I don't know that how did I connected, but I think I just wanted to share my experience and also would like to have a comment from you that I think it's one of the best platform for me, which is disseminating a lot of information that what has been happening in the development sector all across the globe. And what I did, because you guys are sending emails on a daily basis, but I love the email which you are sending on a weekly basis. And the great thing is that you are pulling a lot of information that what has been happening in, whether it's in Ebola in Africa, and what has been happening in Washington DC, and what has been happening in China regarding development, and you are pulling out this information and you are presenting in such a precise and effective manner, which I never saw on any other platform. So, and the other thing is that the surveys you are conducting, the reports you are developing, they are I'm an M&E person, marketing and evaluation person. I never saw such an amazing report that how you are disseminating the information. This is one of the most effective ways. So I just wanted to ask you that how you are doing this, that you're pulling a lot of information from different parts of the world and you are disseminating in an effective manner. So just a comment from you on this.
Thank you. First of all, we really appreciate that. And believe me, the way we look at it as an institution is we're proud of the things we've built, and I appreciate you being a member since 2009 and maybe seeing a lot of the growth. But we still see lots of places where we're not doing as good of a job as we ought to. So we have a real drive for excellence at Devex. And really the only thing we found that works is being there. So it's hard for us to, let's say, report on Pakistan if we don't have a correspondent. And so in the last few years, we've developed a correspondent in Islamabad who really knows the country, knows the issues. And that's how, if you look at our reporting that's come out of that country, it's gotten stronger and stronger. So our answer is really we need to have experts who are on the ground in different parts of the world, ideally from that part of the world, who really know it well. And then we help to disseminate their knowledge back to our global audience.
Oh, thank you. Here.
Okay, thank you very much.
David, who's next?
Hi, how's it going?
Oh, okay. Sorry. I guess 2, 3.
I go next. I'm Caroline, class of 29 from Canada. Oh, sorry. I was just wondering if you're being such a hub for all of this information, is it ever difficult in trying to stay neutral but also feeling like you should also be a voice of this sector?
Yeah, good question. So we are neutral in the sense that we are an objective media platform, but we're not neutral when it comes to the people who do development work. So we are your champions. So you'll notice, for example, if an aid worker is killed somewhere in the world, that's a story we will write about. We want to defend the way aid workers work, their mission, their desire to do work in the world. We're not going to defend, let's say, one approach or one idea over another. We'll try to have a really smart analysis about the good that might be on two sides of an issue. But you won't find on our pages a daily debate about whether we should do development work, whether we should do humanitarian work. We might occasionally have a critic who writes something and we'll publish it, but for the most part, we're dealing with a community of professionals who know this work matters, and we focus on the how. How do we actually achieve the sustainable development goals? And there's plenty of room for debate, and we do not take an angular perspective on the how.
Okay, I'm Victor from Kenya. So with the landscape of donor funding in the developing world really drying out, many organizations are closing down because of lack of funding. So what is your opinion on the future of resource mobilization for non-profit organizations in developing countries like Kenya and the rest of Africa? And also, secondly, I like Devex what they do, giving some opportunities in the non-profit sector, but you find like in the developing countries, it's a circle of given individuals. Once they are through with a USAID project, they'll move on to a UN project, then they'll move on to another World Bank project. So what is your advice of someone like us who are just starting out in the non-profit sector to break into that circle so we can be able to get those opportunities? And lastly, since this is just to poke you a bit, since you started Devex like 18 years ago, what was your vision for it? Do you feel right now you're achieving what you set out to start? And what's your biggest regret so far?
Thank you very much. Great questions. I will try to tackle them quickly because I know there's other people. But to your first point about nonprofits are closing down, how do you generate more domestic resources? I would argue actually the amount of money going to development is growing. It's growing dramatically, and we are going to see a tidal wave of funding in this sector. It's just from different sources. So USAID's budget, it's not going down, it's flat. The Trump administration wants to cut it a lot, but so far Congress has held it up. The Europeans, their budget in general has gone up. The Brits have raised their funding quite a bit. The Germans are higher. Again, some of it's going for things like handling refugees and migration issues within Europe. But overall, funding levels are generally flat or slightly higher from the traditional donors. But there's so much new money coming from the billionaires, from the private sector, from the social entrepreneurs. There's so much new money that I actually think it's not a question of, is there going to be enough money? The question is your business model attuned to capturing those opportunities and delivering a mission against them? So that's the most important thing. You're right, there is quite a circle in places like Kenya, which is a major hub for global development work. You see people who go from one NGO to one UN agency to USAID. One of the reasons, and this gets back to the skill set, there are skills around understanding a sector. There are things like knowing financial engineering or IT, like I talked about. There's another set of skills in development, which is understanding how these bureaucratic institutions function. And those are actually hard skills to get, and they take quite a long time. So if someone has worked on USAID projects for 10 years, they understand the reporting requirements, how to do everything from hiring someone to delivering a monitoring and evaluation report. They know those details. You might have great technical skills, sectoral skills, but if you don't know that, you'll lose out to the person who has those kinds of skills. So I think when you're early in your career, thinking about gaining some of those skills, maybe not dedicating your whole career to USAID or DFID or UN, because in this new era, chances are you're going to want to jump around a lot more and be more fluid. But thinking about those skill sets as a goal, as something you want to gain. And then very quickly, lastly, he asked about, did we attain what we set out to attain? I look at this as a journey. We were trying to build an institution. We don't have a particular benchmark. Of course, we have annual targets, and we publish our impact metrics on our website. I encourage you to take a look. But we look at it as, how do you build an institution that's going to shape the way development works? And the only way we do that is by listening to all of you and understanding what your needs are and seeing whether or not we're actually serving them.
Okay, at last, we only have 5 minutes left. Let me see if I can get these two in. Is that okay, Miriam?
Yeah, one more question.
Oh, you saw her first? Well, she has,
Here.
Go.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Arwa and I'm a fellow from Tunisia. So I have a quick question. So first, thank you for your time and for being here with us. And so based on the trends in the recruitment world, what would you tell a job seeker? Should we pursue further education? I mean, double master's, triple master's, or PhD? Or should we take the unconventional route and pursue more practical credentials such as certifications and stuff? So what would be that piece of advice?
I don't know if this is a satisfying answer, but I think it really depends on what your goals are. And the thing I've seen that can be a mistake, we started Devex when I was in graduate school at Harvard's Government School, Kennedy School. And I saw, it was a very prestigious school and a lot of very talented people there as students, but I saw some students who really shouldn't have been there because they didn't know what they wanted. They just thought, okay, this is a great institution, I got in, I'm gonna go do a degree. But they didn't know why, and so when they graduated, they had a hard time getting a job. They didn't know what to target. So my main advice is to have a sense of what you're trying to accomplish. And if getting that master's or double or triple master's or PhD gets you on that path, okay. If not, think of a different path. But don't just do it blindly because that's what everyone did before. This is still a sector that's highly competitive and where credentials do matter and they will continue to matter. So for many, many jobs, it will matter that you have a graduate degree. I dropped out of my graduate program, I don't have one. But for many positions, I simply couldn't even apply now if I wanted to because it's just a requirement, period. It's not something they will consider otherwise. So you need to think about, do I want to work with the World Bank? That's a place where having a PhD goes a long way. Or do I want to work in a social enterprise? It may not matter so much. Understand what your goal is and then make your career plan against it.
Last question.
Yeah.
Hi, I attended the Devex conference and I'm here in DC for the last 4 months and I really enjoyed it and I work with Al Khan Foundation. And I pretty much actually visit the site every day because I'm in business development. And it really is exciting for me to see that sometimes just being mere advertisers, you're kind of giving off the message that these people are the primes, go for this organization, this is the stuff. So it's a very interesting journey for me to see. So going back to I did some work in Afghanistan and I presented that at Devex, International Disaster Risk Conference. And at that time we had Millennium Development Goals and disaster resilience was not part of the upcoming goals. And actually from that conference, the idea came forward that disaster resilience should be made part of the new sustainable development goals. So I kind of challenge now Devex and your platform because you bring together these giants, you bring together thinkers. What are the new goals forward for whatever sustainable development goals or whatever the new goals will be? What will be added to those goals? And going back to the discussion on gender equality and all these disparities, I would even take a step forward and say, can we actually, as development professionals, look into having the importance of having pluralistic outlook when the world is getting more and more intolerant of each other? Can we actually think about that as development professionals? Because doing development in the Muslim society for the past 8 years, I have been faced with numerous encounters where we are actually not understanding each other. There is serious communication gap. It's not clash of civilization. I again and again refer to it as clash of ignorance. Mere ignorance on this side of the world, on that side of the world, you call it North and South, developing countries or developed world, whatever. Do you think that we can actually achieve that kind of level?
Great questions. Let me say thank you, first of all. I'm glad you came to Devex World. I think the phase we're at with the Sustainable Development Goals now, because we have these goals and we have so many targets and indicators, is not developing new ones at the global level. We kind of know what we need. There's all this complexity. It's a good complexity. It reflects the reality of the world. It's much more at the level of the country and increasing at the level of your organization or institution. So what I've noticed is many corporations, I think the latest statistic is 43% of the biggest 250 companies in the world, so almost half of the biggest companies in the world, have figured out how their corporate responsibility aligns to the Sustainable Development Goals. They've written it down, they've come up with some kind of a framework. That's quite impressive. I think the numbers, I don't have the exact figures, are less in the NGO community. They're less in the development community in a way, because we all say, hey, we made our own strategy, we have our own plan, we know the issues very well. But I think it's time we actually really adopt the SDGs as a development community by aligning what we do against it. Doesn't mean you have to change everything you're doing, but at least use it as a framework, because that's ultimately what will let us have development strategies at the country level or at the community level. To your point and kind of your call to action around having a more pluralistic outlook, I think you're right, and we're very open to ideas at Devex about how we can better do that. One of the things, kind of getting back to some of the earlier questions, that has made us successful is really listening. So we want to hear from you. Maybe I can close on this point. We want to hear from you about what are we missing? What are we not covering? What issues are out there that you're experiencing every day that you don't see in our pages? Do you find us to be too European or too African sometimes? Or what are there regions you feel like are just underrepresented in our coverage? And help us to fix that. Give us ideas on what else we should be covering.
Yeah, thank you so much. That brings us to the end of the session. I don't want the session to end because it's such an interesting conversation, but I think we're running out of time and people would be they're waiting for a break. Thank you so much, Raj, for being with us. I think a lot of people, looks like they enjoyed the session.
I did. I certainly did.